I fed and sheltered a lonely old man on Christmas night, then I had no idea this would change my life. Christmas Eve in a truck stop diner wasn't exactly magical. The fluorescent lights buzzed, the coffee had that all-too-familiar burnt smell, and the air carried a mix of bacon grease and diesel fumes from the big rigs outside. But hey, it paid the bills, most of them, anyway. I wiped down the counter, watching the clock crawl toward midnight. Another holiday spent slinging pancakes and pouring coffee for folks who didn't have anywhere else to be. At 28, this wasn't exactly where I thought I'd be. I lived in a trailer that could probably lose a fight with a stiff breeze, and my dreams of becoming a mechanic were just that, dreams. College wasn't cheap, and tips from truckers and exhausted families on road trips weren't stacking up fast enough to change that. The diner had its usual crowd. A few truckers half listening to the radio while shoveling in greasy food, a couple of locals too stubborn to admit they should have gone home hours ago, and me, just waiting for my shift to end so I could go home to my freezing trailer and a fridge that was probably as empty as my bank account. Then he walked in. The old guy shuffled in like he was carrying the weight of the whole world on his back. His coat looked like it had seen more winters than I had, patches holding it together like a bad memory that just wouldn't quit. He had that look, like he'd been running on empty for too long and finally hit the last mile. He slid into a booth near the window, pushed a few crumpled bills onto the table, and asked for a coffee, just coffee. His voice was low, tired, like talking took effort he didn't have to spare. I poured his cup, and he wrapped his hands around it like it was the only warmth left in the world. He barely drank it, just sat there staring out at the snow-covered parking lot. I'd seen a lot of lonely people in this place. Truckers with pictures of kids they hadn't seen in months. Women leaving town with everything they owned in the back seat of their cars. Guys like me, pretending they were just between things when, really, there wasn't anything waiting for them. But this man, this was different. It wasn't just the way he looked, like he hadn't eaten a real meal in weeks. It was the way he sat there, like the world had forgotten about him, and maybe he'd started to forget about it, too. The clock hit midnight. Christmas. No phone calls. No family showing up late. Just a man and his coffee. The other customers were thinning out. One of the truckers left a 20 on the counter with a nod, mumbling something about getting back on the road. A couple of regulars wished me a Merry Christmas on their way out, which sounded more like an obligation than an actual sentiment. I leaned against the counter, pretending not to notice the way the old man's hands trembled every time he lifted the cup. The way he blinked too long, like just staying awake was a fight he wasn't sure he wanted to win. Outside, the snow thickened. The highway stretched on, endless and empty. Inside, a man who looked like he had nothing left sat alone, staring at a world that had already moved on without him. I grabbed the coffee pot and walked over, topping off his cup without asking. He looked up at me, his eyes tired but sharp, like he was surprised someone had even noticed he was there. "You're gonna need more than just coffee if you're planning on making it through the night," I said, nodding toward the menu. "Kitchen still open." He hesitated, glancing at the cash on the table like he was doing math in his head, and I knew that math too well. "On the house," I added before he could say no. "Christmas special." The way he looked at me then, it wasn't gratitude, exactly. More like he was trying to remember what kindness felt like. Who was he? And why was he spending Christmas Eve like this? I didn't know it yet, but this night was about to change everything. I didn't usually give out free meals. The owner kept a tight grip on inventory, and anything that went missing got deducted straight from my paycheck. But it was Christmas, and if this guy had anywhere else to be, he wouldn't be sitting in a booth at a truck stop diner, counting crumpled bills like he was hoping they'd multiply. I grabbed the last portion of hot soup and a burger from the back, stuff meant for the staff when the shift ended, but no one would miss it. Slipping the plate in front of him, I muttered something about a Christmas special and walked off before he could argue. He hesitated at first, like he wasn't sure if it was a trick. But hunger wins over pride, and pretty soon he was eating like he hadn't seen a decent meal in weeks. Watching him shovel food into his mouth made me wonder just how long it had been since his last warm meal. I busied myself refilling coffee cups, pretending not to notice the way he slowed down halfway through, like the weight of the world had just caught up with him. He set his fork down and stared out the window again, his reflection barely visible in the frost-covered glass. "Drove out to see my son," he said, voice rough from either age or whatever life had thrown at him. "Figured I'd surprise him, meet my grandson for the first time." That got my attention. I leaned against the counter, waiting for him to go on. "Guess he didn't feel the same way," he continued. "Didn't even let me in the house. Told me to turn around and go back to where I came from." He let out a short, bitter laugh. Not the kind that says something is funny, but the kind that says it hurts too much to say anything else. "Didn't tell anyone I was coming," he added. "Didn't tell anyone. Just packed up and drove. Haven't had anyone waiting on me for a long time. Maybe I thought if I showed up, if I looked him in the eye, he'd remember I existed, just for a second." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Doesn't matter now." The diner had emptied out except for a couple of truckers nursing their coffee refills, pretending not to listen. Outside, the snow was still falling, thick and steady, burying everything in sight. The roads weren't gonna get better anytime soon, which meant the old man wasn't going anywhere for a while. He rubbed a hand over his face, exhausted. "Don't know why I even came," he muttered. "Guess I just needed to see it with my own eyes. Make sure I never try again." Something about the way he said it didn't sit right. The finality in it. The way he pushed his plate away, barely touched the burger I'd given him, like he didn't see the point in finishing. I've seen guys down on their luck before. But this wasn't just bad luck, this was someone who had lost more than he knew how to get back. I wiped down the counter again, more out of habit than anything else, trying to shake off the weird feeling creeping up my spine. The silence stretched between us, thick like the frost building up on the diner's windows. A car pulled up outside, its headlights cutting through the swirling snow. Some guy in a heavy parka climbed out, muttering into his phone, barely noticing the cold. Probably another traveler caught in the storm. The highway wasn't safe in this weather, not unless you had chains and a serious reason to keep moving. I turned back to the old man. He wasn't watching the parking lot. He was staring down at the paper placemat in front of him, absently running a finger over the diner's outdated logo. His hands looked like they'd done real work once, calloused, rough, like he'd spent a lifetime fixing things. "You ever work with cars?" I asked, mostly just to keep the conversation going. He looked up, eyes narrowing slightly. "Used to. Spent years under the hood of one machine or another. Didn't have much of a choice, grew up fixing things, then spent years under the hood. Kept me busy after my wife left." I nodded. "I get that. Always wanted to be a mechanic myself, but," I gestured around the diner. "Life happens." His lips twitched, almost like he wanted to smile but didn't quite remember how. "Yeah. It does." Then it hit me. His face. His name. Something about him felt familiar, like a puzzle piece I couldn't quite place. I'd seen him before. Somewhere. But where? I didn't know it yet, but this wasn't just some stranger passing through on Christmas Eve. This night was about to get a whole lot stranger. The thought hit me before I could stop it. I had a couch. Not much of one, old, lumpy, and probably stuffed with more dust than cushion at this point, but it beats sitting in a cold diner all night. The guy clearly wasn't in a rush to hit the road, and with the storm outside making the road slicker by the minute, I knew he wasn't going anywhere fast. I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the coffee pot as I refilled his cup. Inviting some random guy back to my place wasn't exactly something I did. But something about him sat wrong with me, the way he barely reacted to the warmth of his drink, the way he looked past me instead of at me, like he was already somewhere else in his head. A guy like that, left alone in the wrong place, could end up as just another bad memory for the world to forget. The words were out before I could second-guess myself. "Look, I got a place not far from here. It ain't much, just a trailer down the road, but it's warm. Got an old couch that's still got some life left in it if you need a spot to crash. No strings, no favors, just figured you'd rather sleep under a roof than out there in this mess." The old man barely reacted at first. He just sat there, hands wrapped around the coffee cup, watching the steam curl into the air. The only sign that he'd even heard me was the slow way his shoulders tensed, like the offer carried more weight than I intended. "I don't take charity," he muttered finally, his voice quiet but firm. "Ain't right." I shrugged, keeping my tone casual. "It's not charity. It's just a couch. If it makes you feel better, you can call it a favor, one you don't even have to pay back." He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "That's the problem. People always want something back, whether they say it or not." I couldn't blame him for thinking that way. The world didn't give out free passes, especially not to guys like him. But I wasn't offering much: a couch, a roof, a break from whatever was weighing him down. If that was enough to set off alarm bells, then he'd been let down by too many people for too long. For a minute, I thought he was going to refuse outright. His fingers tightened around the cup, his jaw set like he was bracing for an argument. But then he sighed, slow and deep, like he was exhaling a decade's worth of stubborn pride. "You know," he said, more to himself than to me, "this is the first time in 10 years someone's offered me something without expecting a damn thing in return." His voice was even, but there was something raw beneath it, something that made my chest tighten in a way I didn't expect. He didn't say yes, not outright, but he didn't say no either. And that was good enough for me. I grabbed my jacket, tossed a couple of bills on the counter for my own meal, and gestured toward the door. "Come on. Let's get out of here before the snow buries my truck." He hesitated for just a second longer, then, with a sigh that felt heavier than it should, he stood up and followed me out into the cold. The parking lot was coated in fresh snow, my truck barely visible under the thick layer of white. The cold hit like a slap, sharp and unforgiving, making me regret not grabbing my gloves before heading outside. The old man pulled his coat tighter around himself, his breath visible in the air, but he didn't complain. Just kept his head down, trudging through the snow beside me. "Hope you don't mind a little mess," I said as I yanked open the truck door. "Ain't had much time to clean lately." He let out something that almost sounded like a laugh. "Mess don't bother me. Had enough of it in my own place." The drive back to my trailer was quiet, just the sound of the heater struggling against the cold and the occasional rattle of the old truck over potholes. I wasn't much for small talk, and he didn't seem like the type to force a conversation. Still, the silence wasn't uncomfortable. Just two guys who'd found themselves stuck in the same place on the same cold night. When we pulled up to my trailer, I half expected him to change his mind. To thank me for the offer and say he'd figure something else out. But he just followed me inside, shaking the snow from his coat as he glanced around the small, cluttered space. "Ain't much," I said, tossing my keys onto the counter. "But it's warm." He nodded, stepping inside fully and closing the door behind him. The wind howled outside, rattling the thin walls, but in here, at least, we were out of the worst of it. I grabbed a couple of blankets from the closet and tossed them onto the couch. Couch ain't fancy, but it's got more padding than the diner booth. "You need anything else, just holler." For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at the couch like he wasn't sure if he should sit down or bolt right back out into the storm. But eventually, he let out another one of those heavy sighs and lowered himself onto the cushions, the tension in his shoulders easing just a little. "Appreciate it," he said finally, voice quieter than before. "More than you know." I just nodded, heading to the kitchen to grab a couple of beers from the fridge. If we were gonna be stuck inside all night, might as well make it comfortable. You know, he said after a while, this is the first time in 10 years someone's offered me something without expecting a damn thing in return. His voice had that same weight to it, like he wasn't just talking about the couch or the meal. Like he was talking about something bigger. I didn't know what his story was, not yet. But something told me this night wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The trailer wasn't anything special, but it was home. The floor creaked in places, the heater rattled if you bumped it the wrong way, and the couch, well, calling it comfortable would have been generous. But it was clean, warm, and smelled like hot cocoa, thanks to an old tin of instant mix I kept around for nights like this. The old man settled onto the couch, adjusting the blankets like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to get comfortable. I didn't blame him. When life knocks you down enough times, even small kindnesses start to feel like tricks. I set 2 mismatched mugs on the table and stirred the cocoa, the powdered mix clumping just enough to remind me I should have thrown it out months ago. But it was warm, and on a night like this, that counted for something. We sat in silence for a while, the only sounds coming from the wind rattling the trailer walls and the occasional creak of the couch springs when he shifted. He took a sip of his cocoa, nodding to himself like he hadn't tasted something this good in years. I leaned back in my chair. So, you got anyone else? Besides your son? He didn't answer right away. Just stared down into his mug like he was trying to read something in the steam. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something heavy. Once, I had everything, he said. Money. A business. People who called me a friend. I raised an eyebrow but didn't push. I'd heard guys tell stories before, some exaggerated, some straight up fiction. But something about the way he said it made me think he wasn't lying. He took another sip, rolling the cup between his hands. Funny thing about success. It makes you think you're untouchable. That you've got the right people around you. Then one day, you wake up, and they're gone. Just like that. I let that sit for a moment. I'd known people like that, folks who had everything, lost it overnight, and never quite found their way back. Some crawled their way out. Some didn't. What happened? I asked. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. What always happens? Trusted the wrong people. Put everything in their hands. Next thing you know, your name's on a lawsuit instead of a paycheck. That caught my attention. Lawsuit? That wasn't small-time failure. That was something bigger. He chuckled, but there wasn't any humor in it. Thought I had friends. Turns out, all I had were people waiting for me to slip. I watched him carefully. The way his fingers tightened around the cup. The way his eyes drifted, not just to the past, but to something deeper, something unfinished. You ran a business? I asked. He nodded. Built it from nothing. Spent years making it work. Thought I was set. But the thing about money? It makes people greedy. Partners. Employees. Even family. His jaw tightened, and he let out a slow breath, shaking his head like he was trying to push away old memories. I knew that feeling. Maybe not on the same scale, but I'd learned the hard way that people weren't always what they seemed. I wasn't about to tell him my sob story, though. Tonight wasn't about me. Ever think about trying to rebuild? I asked, mostly just to keep the conversation going. He let out a low chuckle, finally looking up at me. Kid, I don't even know where to start. Last time I tried, I ended up with a truck that barely runs and a name people stopped trusting. I glanced toward my tiny kitchen, where my tools were still scattered from the last time I'd tried fixing up my own car. Well, I said, standing up, if there's one thing I know, it's that anything can be rebuilt. Just gotta know where to start. The wind howled outside, but inside, everything was still. He wasn't just another guy down on his luck. There was more to his story. A lot more. And somehow, I had a feeling this night wasn't over yet. I grabbed his coat to hang it by the door, but as I lifted it, something slipped out and hit the floor. A small, stiff rectangle landed face up at my feet. I bent down and picked it up, rubbing my thumb over the faded edges. An old business card, its ink slightly smudged but still legible. Richard Golden. My stomach twisted. Any mechanic in Ohio knew that name. He wasn't just some guy who used to run a shop, he built an empire. Golden auto shops were everywhere, known for quality work and fair prices. Then one day, they vanished. No scandal, no warnings. Just gone. And now, the man himself was sitting on my couch, sipping instant cocoa like he had nothing left. I shoved the card back into his coat, my mind racing. Should I ask? Should I pretend I hadn't seen it? If he wanted to talk about it, he would, right? Before I could decide, Richard let out a deep sigh and rubbed his hands together, staring at his cup like it held answers. Bet you're wondering how a guy like me ended up here, he muttered. I didn't answer. I just let the silence sit between us. Yeah, he said, almost to himself. I used to be that Richard Golden. The guy with the garages, the reputation, the family. He let out a short, bitter laugh. Funny how fast things change. I leaned back, listening. He didn't seem like the type who needed much encouragement to keep talking. He was already halfway down memory lane. Had it all once, he continued. Started with one shop, built it up from nothing. I wasn't some rich kid playing businessman, I worked under the hood, just like my guys. Built something real, something I was proud of. Married a woman 20 years younger. Maybe that was my first mistake, but I didn't see it at the time. He took another sip, rolling the cup between his hands like it might slip through his fingers. We had a son. Good kid, or so I thought. Grew up around cars, around the business. Thought he'd take after me, maybe even make it bigger. And my wife, she knew how to talk. She made me believe it was time to pass things down, to let go a little. He shook his head. So I did. Signed the papers, handed it over. Thought I was giving my son a future. I already knew where this was going, but I didn't interrupt. Didn't take long to figure out I was a fool. My wife left not long after, took half of everything. Next thing I know, my son's taking her side. One day, I've got a business. The next, I'm locked out of my own office. Lawyers, paperwork, loopholes, things I never cared to learn about, because I trusted them. His jaw tightened, his fingers curling around the mug. I thought maybe I could start over. Took what little money I had left, tried to open another shop. But by then, I was just some old guy with a name that didn't mean anything anymore. Word spreads fast when you lose everything. Couldn't get suppliers, couldn't get credit. Eventually, I couldn't even get work. So I stopped trying. The room was quiet except for the wind outside, rattling against the trailer's thin walls. I sat back, trying to process everything. This wasn't just some unlucky guy. He'd been gutted by the very people he built his life around. The people he trusted most. I worked my whole life. Played it straight. Thought if you did right by people, they'd do right by you. He let out another humorless chuckle. Guess I was wrong. He finished his cocoa and set the mug down carefully, like he was afraid of breaking something. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. What do you even tell a guy who lost everything to his own family? I stood up, grabbed a blanket from the back of the couch, and tossed it over him. Get some rest, I finally said. Storm's not letting up anytime soon. He didn't argue. Just gave me a tired nod and stretched out, pulling the blanket up to his chin. I went to my room, but sleep didn't come easy. My mind kept circling back to his story, the way his voice had cracked just slightly when he said his son's name. I stared at the ceiling for what felt like hours, listening to the wind outside, the creaks of the old trailer, the steady breathing of the man in the other room. When I finally did drift off, it was restless. And when I woke up the next morning, Richard was gone. The blanket was folded neatly on the couch. His mug sat in the sink, rinsed clean. And on the counter, a piece of paper with a few words scribbled in shaky handwriting. "I won't forget what you did for me." That was it. No explanation. No goodbye. Just those words. I stood there for a long time, staring at the note, wondering if I'd ever see him again. Somehow, I already knew the answer. A few days had passed since Richard disappeared, but I still caught myself glancing at the couch, half expecting to see him there, wrapped in that old blanket. The trailer felt quieter without him, like the night we spent talking had left a weight in the air that hadn't quite lifted. I figured that was the end of it. Just another strange encounter in a life full of them. Then, one evening, just as I was about to settle in with a beer and a bad TV rerun, there was a knock at the door. Nobody ever knocked on my door. I set the bottle down and stood up, feeling that weird mix of surprise and suspicion. When I pulled the door open, I had to blink a few times to make sure I wasn't imagining things. Richard. He looked different, not cleaned up exactly, but more solid. There was color in his face, a kind of energy in his stance that wasn't there before. He was still in that beat-up coat, but this time, he wasn't hunched over, bracing against the cold like it was the only thing keeping him standing. He looked like a man who had made a decision. "Hope I'm not dropping in unannounced," he said, stuffing his hands in his pockets. I stepped back and motioned for him to come inside. "Didn't think I'd see you again." He let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Didn't think so either. But turns out, I had some unfinished business." I watched as he walked inside, glancing around like he was taking in the place all over again. He nodded to himself, like he'd made peace with something. "Went home," he said finally. "Sold the house. Land too. Turns out, that little patch of dirt I've been hanging on to is worth something after all. Developers putting in a shopping center, and they were willing to pay a good price to make me disappear." I raised an eyebrow. "Good price?" Richard smirked, but didn't elaborate. "Let's just say, it's enough. More than enough." I didn't push. If he wanted me to know, he'd tell me. But from the way he was standing, the way he seemed lighter, I could tell this was a man who had finally found a way out. "So what's the plan?" He leaned against the counter, rubbing his hands together like he was warming up for something big. "I got a friend. Old buddy from way back. Lives out in Wyoming, near a lake. Quiet place, away from everything. He's been there for years, just him and the water. Always said I should come out, take up fishing, forget about the world. I never listened. Always too busy." He glanced over at me, a small smile playing at the edges of his mouth. "Guess I'm listening now." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Sounds like a hell of a plan." Richard nodded. "I found myself a little place out there, too. Nothing fancy, just a cabin near the lake. A place where I can just be. No lawyers, no city noise, no ghosts from the past. Just me, an old friend, and some fishing poles." I felt a grin creeping onto my face. "Didn't take you for the fishing type." He chuckled. "Neither did I. But I figure, it's about time I learned." He paused, then glanced at me more seriously. "Listen, I was hoping to stay here tonight. One last night before I head out." "Of course," I said without hesitation. He nodded, then rubbed his chin. "And tomorrow morning, I need you to come with me to the bank. I frowned. The bank? He smirked, shaking his head. You'll see. Just be up early. I need your help. I opened my mouth to ask more, but something in his face told me I wasn't getting any more answers tonight. Whatever it was, I'd find out soon enough. And somehow, I had a feeling it was going to change everything. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. Richard was already up, standing by the tiny kitchen counter in my trailer, sipping from one of my mismatched mugs like he'd been living there for years. He looked relaxed, almost like a man who had finally put his past to rest. Morning, he said casually, flipping through a local newspaper he'd picked up from who knows where. Morning, I muttered, rubbing my eyes. Still not telling me why we're going to the bank? He smirked. You'll see. I sighed, grabbing my jacket. At this point, I knew better than to argue. Richard had his own way of doing things, and I figured I'd just ride along for the mystery. The truck grumbled awake as we drove into town. The sun was barely up, the road still quiet, the kind of morning where most folks were nursing their first cup of coffee and pretending the day wasn't about to start. Richard seemed unusually calm, tapping his fingers on his knee like he had a song stuck in his head. We pulled up to the bank, a small, brick building with a neon open sign buzzing in the window. One of those places where the tellers still knew your name and the manager probably coached Little League on the weekends. Richard climbed out first, moving with a quiet determination. Inside, the bank smelled like coffee and printer ink. A lady behind the counter greeted us with a polite nod, but Richard barely acknowledged her. Instead, he motioned for me to follow him toward one of the desks near the back. All right, he said, sitting down across from a banker who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. My friend here needs to open a new account. I blinked. What? Just trust me. Do it. At this point, I'd learned to just roll with it. So I handed over my ID, signed a few forms, and within 10 minutes, I had a brand new account. Richard took the paperwork, scanned over it, then pocketed my account number with a nod of approval. Wait here, he said, getting up. I'll be right back. Before I could ask, he was gone, heading straight to one of the tellers. I sat there, tapping my fingers on the desk, wondering just what the hell was going on. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. I debated whether to go check on him, but before I could stand up, he strolled back over, looking pleased with himself. All done, he said, sitting down like we'd just finished running errands. That's it? That's it. I narrowed my eyes. You're not gonna tell me what you did, are you? Richard smirked. Promise me one thing, don't check your account until I'm gone. It'd be awkward for both of us. I opened my mouth to argue, but something about the way he said it made me pause. He was serious. Whatever he'd just done, he really didn't want to be around when I found out. All right, I said slowly. I'll wait. Good man. Now, let's get breakfast. We found a diner a few blocks away, one of those places where the coffee is always burnt, the eggs are always slightly overcooked, and the waitresses have been working there so long they practically run the place. We slid into a booth near the window, the vinyl seats squeaking beneath us. You know, Richard said, stirring his coffee, you're the first person in a long time who did something for me without expecting anything back. That's rare. I shrugged. Didn't feel like a big deal. It was. He looked out the window, like he was seeing something far beyond the street in front of us. And I wanted to make sure you knew that. I wasn't sure what to say. So I just nodded, sipping my coffee, letting the moment sit between us. After breakfast, we walked back to the truck. Richard lingered, hands in his pockets, taking in the town like he was seeing it for the last time. Guess this is it, he said. Yeah, I said, not quite sure how to end this. Take care out there. He smirked. You too. And remember, if you ever make it to Wyoming. I'll look you up, I finished for him. I know. He nodded once, then turned and walked to his car. A minute later, he was gone. I sat in my truck for a while before finally heading home. The drive felt longer than usual, the weight of whatever just happened sitting heavy in my chest. It wasn't until I walked through the door that I noticed the notification on my phone, an alert from the bank. I frowned, pulling it up. Probably just a confirmation about the new account. Then I saw the number. $1 million. I stared at the screen, my brain refusing to process what I was seeing. This had to be a mistake. It had to be. But the longer I looked, the more real it became. My legs gave out, and I sank onto the couch, staring at the phone in my shaking hands. Richard had given me a fresh start. A chance at a life I never thought I'd have. And I had no idea how to even begin to thank him. A year later, my life looked nothing like it used to. The trailer? Gone. Finally replaced with a real house, a small, sturdy place with a garage big enough to fit more than just a toolbox and a folding chair. No more worrying about leaks when it rained or if the heater would make it through another winter. It wasn't a mansion, but it was mine, and that was more than enough. And the job? Well, I wasn't just fixing cars in someone else's shop anymore. I owned my own place now, Golden Hands Auto. Naming it was the easiest decision I'd ever made. It wasn't just about fixing cars. It was about second chances, about remembering the man who reminded me that life could turn around when you least expected it. And business? Business was booming. Turns out, when you don't scam people, actually know what you're doing, and treat folks with respect, word gets around fast. Within months, I had more customers than I knew what to do with. Half the town was coming in, and the other half was making appointments for next week. But life wasn't just about work anymore. I met someone. Her name was Emily. She owned the coffee shop down the street, and I'd be lying if I said I hadn't found an excuse to stop in for a cup of her questionable coffee just to see her more often. She had a sharp wit, an easy laugh, and an uncanny ability to call me out when I got too stuck in my own head. And somehow, despite my sarcasm and occasional stubbornness, she stuck around. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. But no matter how good things got, I never stopped thinking about Richard. Some nights, I'd sit out back with a beer, staring up at the stars, wondering if he ever made it to that lake in Wyoming. If he was out there right now, casting a line, soaking up the kind of peace he'd spent so long chasing. One night, something clicked. I couldn't just wonder. I had to know. The next morning, I closed up shop for a few days, packed a bag, and hit the road. No exact destination, no real plan, just a gut feeling and the name of a lake scribbled on a sticky note. I had time. And I owed him that much. I didn't know if I'd find him. But I had to try. And I wasn't leaving until I did.